Hello and welcome. My name is Jack Schneider, curatorial assistant here at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by artist Dan Peterman to discuss his current exhibition at the museum, Sulfur Cycle 2.0, which is on view through March 1st, 2022. The museum is open, so you might hear some rustling and bustling in the background. And by way of introduction, Dan, you, since the mid-1980s, have combined innovative strategies of local engagement and activism with national and international art projects, exhibitions, and installations. You explore intersections of art and ecology, frequently focusing on networks of recycled or discarded materials that function interchangeably as stockpiles, sculpture, functional objects, and critiques of environmental oversight and neglect. Does that sound accurate?
That sounds pretty good, familiar at least.
I got it from your website, so I hope it's still current. You're no stranger to the MCA. You have numerous artworks in our permanent collection, including the benches that we're sitting on now. This is also Dan's third solo exhibition at the museum. It was preceded by Plastic Economies in 2004 and Options 48 in 1994. So we're going to be discussing the latter to some extent today because the current exhibition is a direct response to, and in some sense, a continuation of the 1994 exhibit. Apart from the MCA, Peterman has exhibited at venues such as Documenta 14, the Venice Biennial, Kunsthal Basel, and the Smart Museum of Art, among many others. So Dan, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jack. Thank you.
Yes. So to start, I want to just explain a little bit for viewers the origin of this project that we're kind of sitting in right now. So you originally presented a multimedia artwork titled Sulfur Cycle at the MCA in 1994. And this was part of the Options 48 exhibition, which I'll note was curated by Lynn Warren, who we love, and just retired from the MCA after an amazing 30-year career here as a curator. The project, Sulfur Cycle, in 1994, included in the installation 6 one-ton stacks of drywall that was sort of presented on pallets in a manner reminiscent of how you would find them at a construction site. And this was no coincidence, of course. This was a sort of intentional decision because concurrent to the exhibition, the MCA was in the midst of building their new building. So the 1994 project was one of the final artworks to be shown at the MCA's old building, which is 4 blocks away. And the project was really kind of directly responding to this transitory moment in the institution's history. Mm-hmm. So your intention for the drywall after the close of the exhibition in the old building was for the drywall to be used in the construction of the new building. And you went so far as to include also a sort of architectural model of the 4th floor of the museum in the 1994 exhibition, indicating in red on that architectural model where the drywall should be installed. And where we're sitting today on the 4th floor of the MCA in the Turner Galleries is one of the spaces that you specified for the drywall to be installed. So in your words, this artwork, Sulfur Cycle, was to become permanently yet invisibly on display at the MCA. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a brief introduction to this project. But to begin our discussion, I'm wondering if you could just tell us about what interested you in this drywall you presented as part of Sulfur Cycle.
Sure, yeah, and I also would like to just acknowledge Lynn Warren as a curator of that original project, which was a sprawly, multi-dimensional set of concepts and a kind of systems-based project that was looking broadly at ecological factors, market trading factors, industrial networks, and the museum. And she was a great curator and a kind of partner in helping that project, keep moving ahead, stay very open and flexible and exploratory. And so I just want to acknowledge that, as well as the institution that allowed her to.
Yes, I hope she's watching.
Yeah.
Lynn, if you're out there.
Yeah. But to your question about specifically the drywall, this was a complicated kind of material network, and I was paying attention to a lot of different materials, a lot of different kinds of systems, recycling systems, market systems, waste, and I developed an awareness of what was going on in relation to the wallboard as it connected to coal burning energy power plants, and that there was a connection between gypsum and synthetic gypsum and the filtration of sulfur that was a hazardous emission being released into the environment. And so this technology around synthetic gypsum, as opposed to mining it and building your drywall, this took a byproduct of the coal burning industry, filtered sulfur out of the emissions that would have otherwise been released into the atmosphere, and locked it chemically into a synthetic gypsum. It becomes a part of the chemistry of gypsum. The limestone slurry captures the sulfur. It creates a synthetic, man-made source of gypsum. And it was being produced in the Chicago area by USG as a wallboard. And so to me, it was really fascinating to have this completely invisible kind of backstory of sulfur. And sulfur, of course, without going too far into detail, is the main culprit in the acid rain phenomena that some of us will remember from the past. A direct result of burning coal is that you create sulfuric acid in the environment that can cause lots of damage. So filtering it out was important. So anyway, that whole dialogue was really fascinating to me. The industries that were involved, the material networks, the energy flows. We're also embedded in it as consumers of electricity, builders of homes, and whatever it is. And so that material really became a focus.
Absolutely, and I think that was what was one of the things that was so surprising to me when you were first telling me about this. I had no idea that some drywall was in part derived from fossil fuels. That was a totally new concept to me. And I think you mentioned the other day that now something like 30% of all of the drywall industry is synthetic gypsum drywall. So it really is, I think it was a little more novel in the mid-90s when you made this project, but now it's sort of become this much more common material, which is interesting.
Right, it was more like a pilot project at the time, and the Chicago area, or this part of the Great Lakes area, had all of these elements in play, and yet they didn't have wide awareness or wide exposure. I think it was still a kind of time where culturally we were in a place where people were figuring out what recycled content meant, and I think the wallboard industry was reluctant to say, oh, we have a pollution byproduct we're embedding in your walls. And so there was, I think, actually a reason to kind of say, no, we're not going to
make it
reveal this publicly. And it wasn't a secret. It's not that it was a secret.
But it's not like you're going to the store buying drywall and it's like slapped on it like sulfur content derived from coal. It's sort of meant to a certain degree to be hidden from view a little bit by design. Yeah, and so I was interested in my attitude was much more of that these kind of backstories and the extended chain of consequences, unintended consequences. Those are things that we all, like we culturally broadly, need to understand more. Have an awareness of, and absolutely. And I think that this project very much does that. I mean, I had never considered drywall as closely or as deeply as I had until I started. Your project was sort of this catalyst for me to learn about all this stuff. And I think that that's really important. And you come to it, I think I can imagine people coming to this 1994 exhibition, seeing these stacks of drywall, maybe not even realizing that they're art. It's just so common, this material. It's sort of like, oh, this is here, maybe they're building a new gallery or something. But then that sort of strangeness of it being there in a museum presented as artwork, I think, kind of asks people to pay closer attention to it. And then once you get in it, and then with the sort of explanatory text and the other elements of the project that we'll get to in a minute, you realize that this super common, super simple material is really embroiled in all these kind of
Right.
strange economic systems, politically inflected economic systems.
Right.
So I'm wondering, and it is this sort of multimedia project, the drywall stacks were one element of it. But there was another element of the project which sort of engaged the economic system that the synthetic gypsum drywall was a part of. So I'm wondering if you could talk about this.
Yeah, the EPA, the Board of
Yeah.
Trade, and yeah, at the same time as this industrial filtration, related to emission of coal was going on, also as a response to the pollution aspect of sulfur from burning
Right.
coal. The Environmental Protection Agency worked with the Chicago Board of Trade to create the first market trading rights, a pollution trading rights marketplace. And so of course there was another way to think about tonnage of sulfur in this coal burning industry and the environmental impact of it, and another kind of response. Capturing it into drywall was one way. A kind of cap and trade market experiment was another way. And it's been explored with a lot of different materials and different pollution concepts, and still plays out. It was hard to see how successful this kind of market might be, but at the time of this project was the first market anywhere in the world. And as a publicly administered market, I could participate. I could buy a ton of sulfur along with all of the coal burning utilities that are basically the consumers of these rights to emit. I could also buy a few tons of the right to emit the sulfur into the atmosphere, even though I had no capacity for actually doing it. And because the market created a cap on the total number, the tons that I owned, they were in my account, they were in my control, and I could trade them, I could sell them, I could do whatever I could figure out what to do with them, but eventually they would expire, and those tons would have been prevented from emission. So there was a way of thinking about the ton of sulfur in the gallery that was collectively contained in the drywall, and also thinking about the tons of sulfur that were in my account with the EPA that I had purchased.
There was a sort of mirroring there between,
a really interesting connection, and for me, this way of accessing these economies and these systems and trying to figure out, like, where is the meaning here? How do I make sense of this capacity to connect in a different way rather than just being kind of a blind consumer of energy? And how can I actively participate and think through, like, where does meaning lie in these systems? And
and I think I really admire that, because I think having the ton of sulfur that was in the gallery, there was 1 ton of sulfur within the 6 tons of drywall that was presented. Is, I think, is a little closer to what a artist typically does, which is sort of create an object that goes into a museum. But then when you sort of turn around and you say, actually, I can engage in this real economic system and actually prevent a certain number of tons from being polluted, at that level it becomes, it exceeds the boundaries of the museum's walls, and I think kind of expands what art can do. And you mentioned the sort of expiration date of these things. So that the sulfur allowance permits that you purchased expired in 2001, and you deliberately allowed this to happen, right? So I think what's really brilliant about this is you're taking the acid rain program, the sulfur allowance trading market, which is this really kind of flawed, in my opinion, and a kind of complex economic system of incentives, supposedly to sort of reduce pollution. But you took that system, and by buying these permits with the intention of allowing them to expire, you took this system of incentives and turned it into actually a really simple system of just like direct pollution prevention.
Right.
At least for the couple tons of sulfur that you purchase permits for.
Right. But it was interesting,
yeah.
there's something within that, it wasn't just a kind of activist gesture. Right. Like I bought these tons, they're not going to be released, and so therefore, I deserve a pat on the back for that. It was participating in a system where my purchase of like $1,200 worth of these things was so trivial it was rounded off to zero in the post auction summary, and that was also something that I was wrestling with, like that question of where does meaning lie, to recognize that I was participating and actually engaging in controlling certain tons, having a consequence, but that consequence rounding off to zero, to zero, even through the agents that
are probably buying like hundreds of thousands of tons of these rights, and you're buying a couple.
Right.
But I think what I would say, and I think that is difficult, is that by engaging the system, you're drawing attention to it. So that's kind of like the gesture. You're drawing attention to this very bizarre system, and I think by buying it with the intention of allowing it to expire, for me, or I guess this is a question for you, but I kind of read a criticality in that of the system overall.
Yeah.
By kind of, it's almost like you're subverting it. So I'm wondering, like, what is your opinion of this type of environmental regulation, the kind of cap and trade of it all? Yeah,
well, I think there are pros and cons, and I think the full answer is probably still yet to be determined. I mean, the free market is not necessarily an easy to determine player in like environmental ethics. But certain tools may have an effect. Like this market would have been different had there been a major corporation stepping in to buy these, to really influence the market, to buy this tonnage, and to leave the coal burning industry scrambling a little bit more. Like, how do we deal with this if it really becomes a marketplace and there are more people with the kind of ethical incentive to do what I did? It would have, the market mechanism would have acted quite differently, where I was a trivial effect. It could have been different. Like, it does open up, the market does open up certain possibilities, but it also leaves things, it wasn't a very active and effective market, other than the sense that it did cap. The government could set the limit and then allow the market to operate underneath that cap, and that cap did have a step down of total quantity.
Right.
So I think it's really questionable how well the market mechanism worked, but the cap part of it, as long as that was actually enforced, had a positive effect.
Well, I think too, I mean, from the reading I've done on it, there was a lot of criticism from environmental activists at the time, because this, as you said, this sort of acid rain program, it was the pilot. It was the first large-scale, kind of like national-scale cap and trade program for pollution control, I think, in history. And what this was replacing, what this style of environmental regulation was replacing, was what some called command and control. This was sort of the negative phrase for it, but command and control style environmental regulation that was popular throughout the 60s and 70s. From the sort of founding of the EPA, where it was like, we see an issue happening with pollution, we're going to directly regulate it. So we see somebody doing something wrong, we're going to tell them that they can't do it. Very simple. And then through these weird kind of like neoliberal free market fundamentalist ideas, it was like, no, actually we should use the market to control pollution. which frankly, I mean, it is complicated. It's interesting, but I think the overarching sort of criticism of it from environmentalists is that you would be sort of giving these companies like a license to kill, if that makes sense. You're like, continue polluting.
Right.
We're just going to put this little weird mechanism in place.
There's a lot of room to maneuver underneath that cap.
Exactly.
You know, you're given a certain amount of freedom to still run facilities the way you want to. You could still have hotspots, as they said. It was totally open to certain certain sites really being very pollutive, because the industry could make the choice to say, well, we're building a new facility here. We'll have more sophisticated pollution controls. You know, but we still want to operate this old you know, facility that is causing a lot of sulfur fallout or you know, other kind of pollution effect.
Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely complicated, but I think it's interesting to think about, especially now, as you know, carbon emissions are really the issue that people are talking about in terms of environmental issues, and the acid rain program, cap and trade, has become this sort of historical precedent that a lot of politicians are pointing to as like, this is what we need to do with carbon. You know, and there's a lot of criticisms about this on either side of the argument. But I want to shift a little bit, and we can always come back to this.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just say,
go ahead.
One thing that I think it is useful to kind of look at what the relationship was of this pollution rights market that was happening at simultaneous to the gypsum, you know, the physical material of gypsum filtering sulfur. Like these two parallel systems, both directly looking at sulfur in the environment and ways to deal with that.
They were related, right? Like wasn't the sequestering of sulfur into drywall, wasn't that sort of directly these
they're both responses to the pollution effect of sulfur in the atmosphere, but they were different agencies and very different strategies. The marketplace strategy, and you know, the gypsum industry, for example, just found a source of sulfur. They weren't activists. They weren't involved in pollution control. Synthetic gypsum became a commodity, just simply like you know, other materials that an industry might source could be a byproduct of something, as opposed to a naturally mined, you know, a virgin material source. Like it was part of that kind of complexity of, you know, the world increasingly having
they realize they can make money off of a byproduct.
Byproducts and systems that kind of loop and conserve and sustain. Like it becomes part of the business model, even if it's not something that's fueled by a philosophical commitment or an
Sure.
Yeah. So there's some difference between that marketplace that was the environmental agency of the U.S. government, you know, directly trying to impact that, and coal burners trying to reduce, you know, using the filtration system, but that filtration originally was landfilled, and it then became a secondary kind of the unintended but advantageous consequences that it became a kind of feedstock for the drywall
that they could monetize,
industry.
Interesting. So in 2019, when you and I first started talking about this project, and I'll just say, I mean, when I went to your studio, I was fascinated to hear about this sort of artwork that invisibly resided in the walls of the building that I worked in. And I think when we initially started talking about working on this project together, we thought it would be really important to kind of like find the original Sulfur Cycle drywall panels that have been built into the building. However, pretty quickly what we did find was that the original sculpture, the original drywall panels from the 1994 presentation had kind of disappeared. Neither the curatorial staff at the museum at the time nor the general contractor of this building could confirm if or where the drywall kind of ended up in the building itself. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how your thinking about this project changed after this realization.
I don't think it changed for me as much as it changed for for you or for the museum. You know, kind of accustomed to tracking artworks, knowing where they are.
Right, right.
For me, I was aware at the time that the focus was on the 1 ton of sulfur, which even in the original exhibition you couldn't see. You had access through the 6 stacks of drywall, and the 6 stacks of drywall felt to me like an installation, but not a sculpture. Like those 6 stacks weren't the artwork, right? But the sulfur was in there. And again, a kind of fortuitous condition that this building was under construction, and this could be, you know, those stacks of drywall could then find their way into this building and kind of extend the movement of that 1 ton of sulfur. For me, even though we had an idea where that drywall would be used, you know, somewhere in these galleries, on these floors, it was, at the time, it wasn't me saying where I want them to be, it was more the contractors saying, that size drywall we could use in here because it's a lower ceiling. It's likely to be used here. And then I remember also thinking, okay, now the exhibition was closing in the old museum. How active should I be in like watching it get built into the museum and track? And I decided to be assured and confident that it was happening, that it didn't end up, you know, in a dumpster behind the museum. I mean, I don't think there was much risk of that. But that it did come to the museum, it was built in, and I didn't really feel the need to verify, to scrutinize that process, because in a way it was, okay, the ton is now moving into the walls of the museum. And we have an idea where it's going, but we don't know exactly. And it's a little bit like, you know, it's analogous to the sulfur in the atmosphere too. Like it's not a precise kind of movement or a delineation, or 1 ton versus another ton. You know, it's part of again, like seeking meaning is trying to figure out what do I know, what do I have access to, knowing and seeing, and you know, how can I figure that out? So I knew it was here. I knew it was concretely here in the building, in the kind of atmosphere of the walls of the building. So I didn't have the surprise factor later on that maybe the museum did of like, like now that if we start to you know, revisit this piece, you know, where is it again, and how do we start thinking about that?
No, and I think for me, when we were first talking about this, I think we wanted to treat, or at least I wanted to treat it kind of as you noted, I wanted to treat Sulfur Cycle like a traditional artwork, you know, something with like fixed boundaries, provenance, authorship, whatever. So it felt important to find these, like, where is the specific drywall? But I think once we kind of realized that, you know, it had kind of become indeterminate, the location of it, it really opened up a new way of thinking about this work for me, where it was not, you know, so much about these particular drywall boards. These particular drywall boards were really just representative examples. So the artwork wasn't the 6 1-ton stacks. Those were representative examples of something else, of the synthetic gypsum drywall that was sort of connected to these, you know, bizarre economic systems, as I said, sort of politically inflected economic systems, and then additionally your kind of engagement within the market, the sulfur allowance trading market, like, was the artwork. So I guess it was, I changed from thinking about it as a sculptural work really to more of a conceptual work.
But we did, at the same time, there is the material pathway to follow. So the 1 ton,
it's a conceptual work, but it's very material.
The 1 ton is in these walls, and then the kind of the opportunity that arose to revisit this project was really meaningful to me, because it was, in a sense, ecologically active. Like, it still was in the over time, meaning was changing. Even what it meant in this building over time in relation to these particular walls was continuing to be active and like something that I wanted to explore and not just reframe what the project was in 1994, but to think about what does it mean now? What kind of gestures, carry meaning in relation to that, but that also recognize, ecologically that picture is still in play. There's still a lot of factors in the industrial system, in the environmental system, in the trading markets, and in the kind of consumer end of the world, where the art museum is a consumer of drywall, just as I am in my home.
Right.
So I agree with you that it's a kind of systems awareness that I think over time, even thinking about that for me has changed. For example,
sure.
I know we've spoken a little bit about Timothy Morton and his introduction of hyperobjects.
Right.
Which was 10 years after the original project that I did, but actually that concept helped open some of my thinking about this project.
Absolutely.
To say this is a kind of approach to a hyper object.
Absolutely.
And the sulfur is moving in these very indistinct ways where you can track it, but there's a lot of complexity around the scope, the limits, the boundaries. When it overlaps into something else, like we can follow it as a kind of hyper object, but we never see it directly.
Absolutely, I think that's a perfect way to think about this.
We're seeing it through walls, we're seeing it through drywall. So,
yeah, I think that's a perfect way to think about this. And I think one of my favorite ways of kind of describing what a hyper object is that you know for sure it's a thing, but you can't point at it. It's something that is diffuse. It's something that is, exists within systems, that isn't just an object within itself. A hyperobject is, climate change is a hyperobject, the weather is a hyperobject.
Right.
Sulfur pollution is a hyperobject. You can't point at it, it's invisible, but it's nonetheless very material and is there and it is.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting way to think about this
and
project.
that became a tool for me to kind of reflect on, like, oh, I'm kind of a hyperobject sculptor.
Totally.
Just by nature, like I was interested in things that I found different language for talking about in relation to systems and ecological networks and economies, but it was often materials in motion and kind of extended boundaries or exchanges that were going on, or a kind of balance of things. And I think maybe it's a little link to the benches we're sitting on here, the accessories to an event project, and other projects I've done that deal with post-consumer plastics.
Right.
Because what's interested me in the plastics is similar in the sense that it's the scale of the industry and of the effect of an industry that produces so much kind of rapid use and dispose of materiality that the consequences are growing, and they're huge, and the impacts on oceans, but not only oceans, of just kind of unbelievable quantities of plastic being produced. So these were projects that were also kind of reflections on that, like how do I capture it in a state, but not pose a solution or not over-determine what it means to be working with recycled plastic, but to kind of open up some of that complexity in this reflection on extended economies or networks.
Absolutely.
Of
and
material.
I think that's what's so brilliant about your work, is that there's this sort of subtlety to it, right? Like in a lot of ways, it is this almost kind of matter-of-fact presentation of these materials. And it's not at all didactic. You're not telling people what to think about these things. You're just sort of saying, hey, look at this really interesting, or look at this material. In some cases, as common as drywall, and like look at it a little deeper, think about it a little bit more, and then it sort of explodes into these really interesting narratives and histories and systems. And that's really what I love about your work. But while we're kind of on this topic of invisibility, I wanted to kind of jump forward now and talk about the installation that we're in now.
Yeah.
when I was at your studio a couple years ago, and we were talking about this project and revisiting it, I think one of the questions I asked you was like, how would you make an exhibition about this thing that's diffuse, this thing that's like, that it really is kind of invisible to a certain extent? Like, how would you make an exhibition that was engaging about something that we can't exactly see? So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you came to this format that we're in now, this installation, all of these cuts around us, these cuts into the wall that have then been taken, these kind of excavated pieces have been taken to create this new wall work, which is called Sulfur Cycle 2.0. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how you settled on this format for readdressing Sulfur Cycle 27 years later.
Yeah. Well, as you know, it was there was an evolution of thought around this exhibition, and even around thinking what it meant to revisit a piece. And part of that, I think, is due to how rare that opportunity is, which is a little bit unfortunate, you know, within the art world, institutions, you know, to really revisit past projects and with some patience to, you know, to see what emerges in that process of revisiting something. And so on the one hand, I felt really fortunate to do that, but then I guess in terms of my thinking, you know, I always feel a kind of connection to, especially projects that open up a kind of ecological structure that I'm following. I tend to not put them away, like write them off as done, finished, completed.
Right.
But, you know, the ideas, the core ideas of the projects, they stay with me. I read articles, I read, you know, I'm influenced by different things that allow me to adjust my thinking to, you know, so this was one of those projects that really stayed lively for me, and with a lot of kind of spin-off aspects to it. There's a lot of opportunity to kind of re-engage. I guess I felt that way, and you know, given a concrete opportunity here to revisit this piece in the museum and think about what had been neglected in the project, like in that invisibility. How was that invisibility functioning? What was a resource in the fact that it was hard to grasp as a project, even though the art world is full of examples of conceptual gestures that get, you know, captured in a kind of descriptive contract. Here's what it is, you know. And so it wasn't that it was impossible, but there was just something elusive in the way this was moving between material presence, you know, visibility, the kind of ownership, you know, the arc of the developing original project. All of that made for, you know, an interesting kind of complexity.
Absolutely.
So I think I also felt like a partner in a kind of revisiting of this project, which of course looked at the walls, and you know, we started this notion of like, well, how should we do some sampling? Should we do some re-excavation? Should we try to look at the back sides of the drywall and identify which sheets were where? And I think that idea evolved for me into what became this 2.0 structure, which was a physical mining, you know, kind of using that notion of extraction, going back into the walls, going back to this view that we had in the first brochure. I don't know if we
yeah, we can get it.
that showed the end of the sheets of drywall, like the actual gypsum content, and open up that viewpoint in the exhibition. So, you know, we arrived at cutting these strips out, extracting them from the wall, reordering them, so we're actually looking into the cross-section of the wall, looking at the gypsum as opposed to the finished surface. And so in the present, re-mining, excavating in these walls, and then at the other end of the project, kind of bookending the original project with this excavation in the walls, and then going back to to an earlier excavation which references the extraction of coal.
Right.
And the coal being the source where the sulfur emerges. It was the mining of coal, the burning of coal, the capture of the sulfur from the emission into the drywall, into the walls. And so on this end, we're recapturing the sulfur, and then we're making this notion to the kind of endless extraction, like touching the sulfur as a component of the coal. That was the starting point. So
so it's like this process of really excavating the walls mirrors the kind of origin of the coal content of these walls, which was mined from the earth. So it's sort of this interesting mirroring between where it originally came from and like where it is now, kind of a reenactment almost.
Right.
But there's another element of the installation that I think very much sort of hints at this same thing, which is a video titled Endless Loader, which plays periodically on a loop during the exhibition. And we have a short clip to share with the viewers that will play now.
So the endless loader, that's that other side of the extraction process. The one going on in the walls here, and this reference to the extraction of coal. So it created a new kind of bookended framework structure around the whole Sulfur Cycle project, and I think pointed at the endless quality of mining processes that extraction processes that of course aren't endless, but we for the most part behave as if they're endless. We use energy as if it's coming forever, and so that as a kind of origin point of the sulfur, the whole sulfur equation. I found that to be a kind of powerful, both metaphorically, just of the endless machine.
The dream, the dream of the endless machine.
The dream,
the
kind
fantasy,
of a mythological
really.
creature that feeds the systems that we live in, and the burning of coal that follows that is still. We in this day and age globally, are still struggling with coal emissions, if not sulfur, certainly CO2 byproduct, but petrochemical culture, hydrocarbons in general, we don't manage well, and the transition to something else is long and slow, and I think it's still useful to see this kind of a structure and to think about really, like, is it really endless? Like, we still act as if it is.
Right, absolutely. And it's almost as if, like, I think there's a certain degree to which even recycling as an idea was sort of presented as, a sort of maybe cure to the kind of like, we have this fantasy of endless progress, endless consumption, et cetera, that I think most people understand is just that, a fantasy. And I feel like maybe recycling itself was presented as a way to kind of continue this fantasy of endless consumption, of endless progress.
Yeah.
But I think, it's interesting, as somebody whose work is so historically tied up with looking at recycling, like where do you think it's landed us?
I think we're still in a place where, at times we're really seeing the complexity of our material systems and of our energy cycles, and that one of the burdens of being an artist who works with recycling is the oversimplification that recycling is a solution. In most cases, it's a kind of spin-off trajectory that may have very complex motivations of what industry is behind it, whose business is aided by it. What are the altruistic values that might be pushing it, and are they really looking long term? Are they truly sustainable? And so my interest is usually not that, oh, there's the solution and now I can capture that as a solution, but instead try to find an engaging way to create a holding pattern where you look and you understand, and you may have an avenue for feeling complicit in a system, but also have a kind of to allow space for maybe a wonderment or a fear, or whatever other qualities of encountering something that's like, that's not working right. And yet I do that, and yet there's something beautiful about this system, and I want to believe in this and not in that. Like there's so many kind of human ideas about how we should live and how the world should work and how our systems should work. And in that complexity, I find a lot of room to operate as an artist, not at solutions, but in managing those narratives and figuring out like what are the points of access to really see something and think kind of profoundly about what does this mean to me, and should it change behavior, should it questions really of meaning beautiful. And
absolutely. And I think I have one last question for you before I think we'll take a couple questions from the audience. But I think it kind of ties into what you were just saying. And this will be me asking you a question that you actually inadvertently asked yourself when you wrote this artist statement 27 years ago as part of the 1994 brochure. So I'm reading your words. In this exhibition, one won't find a finished artwork, but instead an introduction to an ongoing discussion and negotiation. Indeed, here we are 27 years later, still talking about it. It will be fleshed out, so to speak, in the Museum of Contemporary Art's new building when the wallboard from this installation is archived in the museum's walls. But this won't close the discussion. The emission rights presented here will not expire until the year 2001. Until then, they remain transient, negotiable, marketable entities. Over time, perspectives on what this all means, what values are at stake within the context of the museum or within society in general, are likely to change. What will be undeniable, however, is that the sulfur will be there in the walls, in the permanent collection, one might say, and not in the atmosphere. How, after all, do we determine the meaning that lies in that?
Right.
So my question for you, and you alluded to this earlier, the kind of special circumstances of this exhibition being that you are able to revisit this project that you initiated 27 years ago. I'm wondering if there's anything that's changed for you in terms of what the meaning of the project was in 1994 and what it means to you now. It's a big question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. There are things that have come about through this process of envisioning, like, this revisit and a kind of companion exhibition that I didn't see. Like, I didn't know what it would feel like to go back. I never had a clear sense of here's how to revisit this in the future. Even though I had a clear sense the conversation would continue, I didn't have a handle on what this would mean as an artwork or how it would kind of play out over time, but that it would be active. And so in a way, it's a little bit of an evasion of the answer, but it was kind of, I think, built in that I that I wouldn't know. I would have to learn down the road. You know, I would be here with the institution figuring this out, or I would be outside with maybe an uncooperative institution that wasn't engaged in, you know, like I had no guarantees on you know, but I had a kind of, the project was tethered to the building and to the institution, and that opening would be there. So there are a lot of things that have changed, but it's not a surprise that you know, I've had to adjust and kind of find unexpected qualities, like in opening up these walls, or arriving at the presence of making these cuts, and then a kind of secondary byproduct of that is creating an artifact that allows a new way to look at the walls. Like I had no concept of that. And
you mean you didn't plan in 1994 to have a show in 2021?
There was no plan. There also wasn't a plan that, you know, a young curator would come in and say, look, I really want to revisit this and I want to talk. You know, I had no clue that Naomi Klein was going to, you know, develop the kind of critique of the emissions trading markets, or again, like Timothy Morton's hyperobjects as something that then becomes part of my toolkit that allows me to think a little bit differently about what I've already been doing. But
absolutely.
You know, so there are lots of examples like that where I'm also following along. So so there are a lot of things that have changed for me.
Yeah, and I would say just what I find so interesting about this is that when you developed this project in 1994, as you said, both the kind of synthetic gypsum drywall, coal burning derived synthetic gypsum drywall was sort of novel, as was the acid rain program, which I don't even know if it had officially kicked into gear until the year after the exhibition, 1995. So these are both really novel processes, and then looking at it again, almost 3 decades later, you can see that, you know, one, synthetic gypsum drywall has become so much more common, and then two, that the acid rain program has become this incredibly influential policy, essentially, in politics, and it's something that people are looking to, you know, as early as, like, I think in the 90s, Bill Clinton was saying, like, you know, we need to do the same thing for carbon that we did with sulfur with the acid rain program. So it was almost in like you know, I don't want to oversell it, but I think almost the project in 1994 was a little bit prescient in that regard, in kind of looking at these two things that really did end up becoming incredibly influential, especially the acid rain program. So I think it's really apt to revisit it in this moment now, where we still don't know what the hell we're going to do about carbon emissions globally. It's still this, you know, there's this political stalemate of what to do, and one of the things that's on the table is large-scale cap and trade of carbon emissions. So I think revisiting a project like this that was dealing with that in such a subtle and, I think, beautiful way now makes a lot of sense to me. Should we take questions from the audience?
Sure.
Okay. And they're texted to my phone. Thank you, Cameron, if you're out there. So a question from Cameron, actually, is he's wondering if the museum, quote unquote, he used quotes, owns Sulfur Cycle in its collection, and if so, what does that look like? So I can answer this one, or you can answer this one.
I'll answer a brief version, but there are two sides of the equation, I guess. As an artist, to me, I always found it really fascinating that somehow we had not clarified. It wasn't owned. The museum didn't own this piece directly. There never was a contract. I was never paid for this being part of the permanent collection of the museum, for example. It was embedded in the walls. And you know, I've been involved in a number of projects that have a certain amount of slippage.
Sure.
Like in terms of how do you own this? Not even
Exactly.
who, or why would you, or things that have like had profile in the art world that usually would confer like this is an object of value in the art world with an exhibition history and so forth. But I've also had things like that kind of slip back into just a container full of stuff.
Right.
And I've been really fascinated by that some of those economic questions. So so I've been patient and open over a long period of time, knowing there are some unresolved qualities here that are fundamental to the nature of this project, fundamental to Sulfur Cycle.
Right.
And I'm going to at least at some point down the road knock on the door of the museum and say, hey, do you guys want to like revisit some of this?
I hope
so. I didn't have a
will.
fixed position about what should happen, but
sure.
I found it a really fascinating quality of the project that it had somehow slipped in between kind of the standards that are normally so clear about who owns what and is it a part of a collection or not,
sure.
or is it? And this one had slipped into the walls and existed in in kind of a different place.
Well, and I think that's, in my opinion, that is a sign of a good artist. It's one that's making things that kind of challenge our systems for cataloging and archiving things, really. As we've been talking about, I think this whole time that this is not a project that is summed up in a single object, as a traditional artwork is. So I think it makes sense to a certain degree that it kind of has these slippages or kind of slips in and out of systems, or our ability to kind of recognize it as an artwork as such. Although I do hope at some point the museum will bring it in, so to speak. We have time for just one more question, and this is coming from the audience. Someone is wondering how this project, Sulfur Cycle, relates to your broader practice, your other work.
I think at the time that it developed, there was a bit of a higher hurdle dealing with the complexity of like the industrial, what was happening chemically in the industries. Like there's kind of a burden to you have to understand this, and then you can begin to get a feel for what I'm doing as an artist. In developing this project, this kind of constellation of things. And so it always felt like a challenging project, like one that made total sense to me, that I like felt really clear about pursuing this project, but it operated a little bit differently because of that a kind of knowledge base to get into the project. But so in that sense, it's always been kind of a handful of a project, but
sure.
but something that has been very like I guess all the projects that have meant the most to me, there's something that really comes out of a time and a place and a kind of coming together, and it's not something that I could just equip my studio, build it, and it's done, and there's the artwork.
Right.
It's really engaging in something with a lot of complexity over time, dependent on a lot of external things. And so I think this was one of those projects that that really revealed that way of working. It was challenging in ways for me, and it sort of has continually been in that place. Like you just have to go where the project takes you.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're about out of time, but I just want to thank you, Dan, so much for being here today, for working on this project. I've been an admirer of your work for years, so this is sort of a dream come true for me. So just thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jack, and for your curatorial input in this the whole project of revisiting this.
Of course.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure.
It's been great.
And thank you to the audience for attending. Thank you to our wonderful AV team. And the museum is open, as I mentioned at the top of the talk. This exhibition is open through March 1st, 2022, so you have plenty of time to come see it whenever you feel comfortable doing so. All right.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.